October 1896, workers demolishing an old warehouse in Louisville, Kentucky, broke through a brick wall and discovered something that had been hidden for over half a century, a sealed iron box. Inside were 23 documents that would remain locked away by court order until 1968. A marriage certificate dated March 17, 1841. The signatures, Missouri Senator Philip Perry and a woman named Harriet Preston. The problem, Missouri law in 1841 made this marriage impossible. Violators faced imprisonment and financial ruin. Senator Perry was one of Missouri's most prominent politicians, a lawyer, slave owner, and vocal defender of states' rights. Harriet Preston was legally classified as his property, purchased from a Virginia estate in 1838. Yet the certificate existed, bearing not only their signatures, but also the seal of a minister and 4 witnesses who'd risked everything to participate in a ceremony that could destroy them all. The documents in that iron box told a story that challenged everything 19th century America claimed to believe about race, law, marriage, and slavery itself. Over the next half hour, you'll discover 3 things. First, you'll hear how a respected senator came to risk his entire political career for a relationship his world insisted could not exist. Then you'll learn what happened when their secret began to unravel, when political enemies circled, when a child's existence threatened to expose everything, and when Senator Perry faced an impossible choice between family and power. And finally, you'll understand why this story remained sealed for 72 years, and what it reveals about love, law, and the spaces between what society demands and what human beings actually do. This isn't a simple tale of forbidden romance. It's far more complicated than that. Let's begin in St. Louis, Missouri, in the late 1830s, where the seeds of this impossible relationship were planted. St. Louis in 1839 stood at the crossroads of American expansion, a city caught between its French colonial past and its future as a gateway to Western territories. The population had exploded from barely 5,000 souls in 1830 to nearly 17,000 by 1839. The riverfront was chaos incarnate. Steamboats arrived daily from New Orleans and Pittsburgh, their smokestacks blackening the sky, cargo piled on the docks in mountains, cotton bales still smelling of the fields, furs from the northern territories. Manufactured goods from eastern cities, whiskey barrels stacked 5 high. Teams of enslaved workers and free laborers loaded and unloaded this commerce from dawn until long after dark. The smell of the river, thick with mud and sewage and rotting vegetation, mixed with smoke from the steamboat furnaces and the perpetual dust from unpaved streets that turned to soup when it rained. Into this world came Senator Philip Perry, 41 years old, serving his 2nd term, representing Missouri and Washington. He'd arrived in St. Louis in 1823 with $200, a trunk of law books, and a talent for making useful connections. By 1830, he'd married into one of the city's French Creole families, accumulated enough political capital to win election to the Senate, and built a life that looked perfect from the outside. His wife Louise had never loved him. Their marriage was a business arrangement, her family's money launching his political career. They had 3 children, a substantial brick house on Market Street, maintained by 6 enslaved workers, and they moved in the highest circles of St. Louis society. In April 1838, Senator Perry purchased a young woman at a St. Louis slave auction. The transaction was recorded in the ledger of James Thornton, slave trader. Female, age estimated 18 years, from Virginia estate dispersal, literate despite state laws, skilled in household management and bookkeeping. Price, $750. The unusually high price reflected the woman's education and skills, qualities that made her valuable but also potentially dangerous. Her name was Harriet Preston. You've just heard how a senator and an enslaved woman first came into each other's lives. What happens next challenges everything we think we know about relationships during slavery. If you're the kind of person who wants to hear stories like this, stories that don't make it into the history books, stories that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past, then you're exactly who we make these videos for. Every week we dig into the archives, track down sealed documents, and uncover what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling and the textbooks looked away. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let me tell you about the woman who would change Senator Perry's life forever. Harriet Preston stood about 5'6", unusual height for a woman of that era, with dark eyes that betrayed an intelligence her circumstances demanded she conceal. She had been born in 1820 in Charlottesville, Virginia, on an estate owned by Alexander Preston, a tobacco planter who'd fallen on hard times. Preston had educated several of his enslaved workers in the 1790s, before Virginia law made such education illegal, and had allowed those workers to teach their children, despite the changing legal landscape. By the time Virginia tightened its laws in 1830, enforcing harsh penalties for teaching enslaved people to read, Harriet was already literate, already trained in household management, already aware of a world beyond the plantation that most enslaved people never glimpsed. When Alexander Preston died in 1837, his estate was sold to settle debts. Harriet, then 17 years old, was purchased by a slave trader who specialized in moving educated enslaved workers from the exhausted lands of Virginia and Maryland to the expanding markets of the Mississippi Valley. She spent 6 months in the trader's holding facility in Richmond, along with 30 other people being prepared for sale further south and west. In April 1838, she stood on an auction block in St. Louis whilst merchants and planters examined her as if she were livestock, checking her teeth, her hands, asking her to read passages from newspapers to verify her literacy. Senator Perry purchased Harriet with the intention of using her as household manager, someone who could supervise the other enslaved workers, manage household accounts, and handle correspondence. His wife Louise had never been interested in household management, preferring to spend her time on social obligations and the constant round of teas, dinners, and parties that occupied St. Louis's elite class. For the first year, the arrangement worked exactly as Senator Perry had intended. Harriet managed the household with quiet efficiency. She kept meticulous account books, supervised the other workers, ensured that the constant entertaining, required by the senator's position, happened smoothly, and remained nearly invisible in the way that enslaved workers were expected to be, present when needed, absent from notice when not. But something shifted in the winter of 1839. The senator had returned from Washington for congressional recess, whilst Louise had traveled to New Orleans with the children to visit her sister, planning to be gone until spring. This left the senator and Harriet essentially alone in the house, along with the other enslaved workers who lived in the separate quarters behind the property. Without the need to entertain guests or maintain the performance of conventional domesticity, the house became simply a place where two people lived and worked. One evening in early December 1839, the senator was working in his study on a speech about Western expansion. He was frustrated, unable to find the right words. Harriet entered to bring him coffee and found him surrounded by crumpled papers. Without thinking, she suggested a phrase from Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, a book she'd read years ago in Virginia when she'd had access to Alexander Preston's library. The spirit of moderation should be that of the legislature, she said quietly. Good arising from the very nature of things is produced slowly, whilst evil, arising from a contrary cause, is produced rapidly. The senator stared at her for a long moment, surprised not just that she knew Montesquieu, but that she'd recognized how the argument could support his position. They talked for an hour that evening, discussing political philosophy, the nature of government, the tensions between federal power and state sovereignty. It was the first real conversation, the first time the senator had engaged with Harriet as something other than property, as someone whose thoughts and opinions had value independent of her function in managing his household. Over the winter of 1839 to 1840, as Louise remained in New Orleans and the senator worked on various legal and political matters, these conversations became more frequent. The senator began to seek Harriet's opinions, not just on household matters, but on his work. He showed her drafts of speeches, asked her thoughts on legal arguments, discussed political strategies. He discovered that Harriet had read extensively during her time in Virginia, that her education went beyond basic literacy to include history, philosophy, and literature. She had read Shakespeare and Milton, had studied Latin grammar, understood geometry and algebra. For the senator, this was profoundly disturbing because it contradicted the fundamental justification for slavery. If enslaved people were capable of this level of thought, if they could engage with the same ideas as white intellectuals, if they demonstrated the same capacities for reason and reflection, then what possible justification could there be for treating them as property? He tried to rationalize what he was experiencing. He told himself that Harriet was exceptional, an unusual case that didn't disprove the general rule. But these rationalizations became harder to maintain as their conversations continued. As Harriet demonstrated not just the ability to repeat what she'd learned, but to think independently, to form original arguments, to challenge the senator's assumptions. At some point during that winter, though neither could later identify exactly when, the nature of their relationship changed from master and slave to something else. Something that had no name in their world. Something that violated every law and custom, but that felt to both of them inevitable. The change didn't happen suddenly. There was no dramatic moment of decision or declaration. Instead, the relationship evolved through small moments. A hand touching a hand whilst passing documents. The contact lasting a moment longer than necessary. Conversations that lasted until late into the night. Both of them finding excuses to continue talking, even when everything that needed to be said had been said. By February 1840, they were lovers, though that word barely captured the complexity of their relationship. They shared not just physical intimacy, but intellectual partnership, emotional connection, and a deepening sense that they'd found something in each other that neither had experienced before. You know what's remarkable about this story? Most people never hear about relationships like this. They learn about slavery in abstract terms, statistics, laws, economic systems, but not about the actual human beings who navigated impossible situations, who found connection despite everything designed to prevent it. But you're still here, which tells me you're someone who actually cares about understanding history in all its complexity, not just as characters in a morality play, but as human beings making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. That's exactly why this channel exists. We're building a community that refuses to let these stories fade away, that insists on confronting the past honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. If that sounds like something you want to be part of, subscribe. Now let me tell you about the letter that changed everything. In March 1840, Louise Perry wrote from New Orleans, informing her husband that she had decided to remain there permanently. The marriage, she wrote with surprising directness, had been a business arrangement that had served its purpose. Her family's money had launched his political career. His political connections had elevated their social status, and they'd produced 3 children to carry on both family lines. But she'd never loved him, had never wanted to live in St. Louis with its muddy streets and its crude frontier society. Now that she'd returned to the refined culture of New Orleans, she had no intention of coming back. She would keep the children, who preferred New Orleans anyway. He could keep the house, the enslaved workers, his political career, and whatever else he valued. She wanted only a formal separation agreement and enough financial support to maintain her household in New Orleans. The senator received this letter with mixed emotions. Relief, certainly, because the marriage had been hollow for years. Guilt, because he knew his relationship with Harriet had made the marriage even more of a farce. But also a strange sense of possibility. If Louise was gone, if the social charade of their marriage was essentially over, what became possible? He discussed the letter with Harriet, something he would never have done in a conventional marriage, and found that she understood his conflicted feelings better than anyone else could. They talked late into the night about what they wanted, what was possible, what consequences they were willing to face. Harriet was under no illusions about the dangers of their relationship. She knew that if it became public knowledge, the senator would face social ostracism and likely political ruin. She knew that she could face sail to the deep south, separation from the only man she'd ever loved, a future of hard labor and early death on some cotton plantation. Yet knowing all this, understanding the risks, she wanted something more than what they had. She wanted their relationship acknowledged in some way, even if only privately. The senator felt the same way. His entire life had been built on following rules, navigating political and social structures, making strategic decisions that advanced his interests. But with Harriet, he wanted something different. He wanted something real, something that mattered more than political calculation. In late March 1840, Senator Perry made contact with a man named Jonathan Wells, a Methodist minister who served a small congregation in Alton, Illinois, just across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. Reverend Wells was known in certain circles as an abolitionist sympathizer, someone who believed slavery was a moral evil and who'd helped enslaved people escape to freedom more than once, though nothing had ever been proven. The senator traveled to Alton under the pretense of consulting with Illinois lawyers about a property matter. He met Reverend Wells in the minister's study, explained the situation with careful indirection, and asked whether the minister would be willing to perform a marriage ceremony. Reverend Wells listened to the senator's request with a mixture of admiration and horror. He was being asked to violate Missouri law, to create a legal document that could send everyone involved to prison, to participate in something that the senator's political colleagues would consider treason against the racial order. Yet he was also being asked to acknowledge the humanity of an enslaved woman, to validate a relationship built on genuine connection rather than power and violence. After several hours of conversation, Reverend Wells agreed, but with conditions. The ceremony would happen in Illinois, technically outside Missouri's jurisdiction, though everyone understood this was a legal fiction. The marriage certificate would be witnessed but kept secret, hidden away until some future time when society might be ready to acknowledge what had happened. And the senator would have to understand that this marriage, whilst valid in the eyes of God, and perhaps in the eyes of Illinois law, would have no legal standing in Missouri. Harriet would remain legally enslaved. Their relationship would have to exist in shadows and secrets. On March 17th, 1841, exactly 1 year after Louise Perry's letter ending their marriage, Senator Philip Perry and Harriet Preston crossed the Mississippi River to Alton, Illinois. They were accompanied by 4 people who'd agreed to serve as witnesses. Nathan Parker and his wife Susanna Miles, both free black residents of Alton who'd known Reverend Wells for years, and Simon Wallace and his wife Deborah Boyd, white abolitionists who ran a boarding house that served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. The ceremony took place in the basement of Reverend Wells's church at 10 o'clock in the morning. It lasted less than 20 minutes. Reverend Wells read from Scripture, asked the traditional questions, and pronounced Philip and Harriet husband and wife in the sight of God. They exchanged simple gold bands that the senator had purchased in St. Louis from a jeweler who thought they were intended as gifts for relatives. The witnesses signed the certificate. Reverend Wells affixed his seal, and the document was placed in an iron box for safekeeping. Philip and Harriet returned to St. Louis that evening as master and slave. Their marriage a secret known only to 6 other people. Their relationship unchanged in the eyes of the law, but transformed in their own understanding. They couldn't live openly as husband and wife, couldn't acknowledge their relationship publicly, but they'd created something that mattered to them, a commitment that went beyond the accidents of law and custom. For the next 3 years, Senator Perry and Harriet Preston maintained their impossible relationship in the shadows of St. Louis society. To the outside world, the senator was a respected widower, his wife having left him for New Orleans, his household managed by a capable enslaved woman, and no one questioned this arrangement because it was utterly conventional. But privately, behind closed doors, when no visitors were present, they were husband and wife. They shared meals together, something that violated every social custom. They shared a bedroom. They talked late into the night about politics, philosophy, the news from Washington, the senator's work, books they'd read. They created a private world that existed in defiance of the public world. In December 1841, Harriet discovered she was pregnant. This changed everything. A pregnancy could be hidden temporarily, but not forever. A child would raise questions that couldn't easily be answered. The senator and Harriet faced a choice. They could end the pregnancy through methods that were illegal but available for those willing to pay. They could arrange for Harriet to give birth in secret and have the child taken away. Or they could have the child and face whatever consequences came. They chose to have the child. Harriet gave birth in June 1842, attended by a free black midwife named Ruth Coleman, who was paid generously for her discretion. The birth was difficult. Harriet was in labour for nearly 20 hours, lost significant blood, and nearly died from fever. The baby, a daughter, was named Catherine after Harriet's grandmother. According to the legal reality of Missouri in 1842, Catherine was born enslaved. The law followed the condition of the mother. Senator Perry faced the grotesque legal reality that his own daughter was technically his property. We've reached the heart of this story. A senator, an enslaved woman, a secret marriage, and now a daughter whose very existence was impossible under the law. But we're not finished yet. You still need to hear what happened when Senator Perry's political enemies began circling us, when a 2-year-old child accidentally revealed everything, and when the senator faced a choice that would determine all their fates. The most dramatic moments are still ahead. Senator Perry attempted to navigate this impossible situation through legal maneuvers. He drafted a will, leaving everything he owned to Catherine, using careful language that didn't specify a relationship to him. He created a trust fund, managed by Jonathan Wells, that would provide for Catherine's future. He explored options for taking Catherine to a free state where she could grow up free, but realized that removing her from St. Louis would require explanations he couldn't give. Every option contained impossible contradictions. Meanwhile, Catherine grew. She was an active, intelligent child who looked remarkably like her father, with his light eyes and sharp features. The senator doted on her in private, teaching her to read when she was barely 4 years old, playing with her in ways that fathers did with their children, loving her in private whilst unable to acknowledge her publicly. In 1843, Missouri passed stricter enforcement provisions in its slave code, responding to increasing reports of enslaved people escaping to Illinois and Iowa. The new laws increased penalties for anyone helping enslaved people escape and created financial incentives for informing on violators. Senator Perry voted for the laws' passage because voting against it would have raised questions about his loyalty to Southern interests. Then he went home and told Harriet that they needed to make plans for the worst. In the spring of 1844, Senator Perry's political enemies began circulating rumors. Nothing specific, nothing provable, just whispers that the senator had unusual household arrangements, that he was too familiar with his enslaved workers, that he'd been seen in Alton, meeting with known abolitionists. These rumors were weapons in a political fight. Perry represented the moderate faction that believed slavery was secure enough not to require constant agitation. His enemies wanted to push him aside and replace him with someone who'd take a harder line. The crisis came to a head in November 1844. One of the senator's political enemies, a lawyer named Cyrus Stevens, arrived at the house unannounced, claiming to be investigating complaints about the senator's household management. Stevens demanded to see the household accounts, to interview the enslaved workers, to examine the arrangements. Senator Perry allowed Stevens access to the accounts, but not to the workers. Stevens examined the account books that Harriet maintained, noted her handwriting and mathematical precision, and asked pointed questions about her education. As Stevens was preparing to leave, Catherine, then 2 years old, ran into the room calling for her pup. The child went directly to the senator, who picked her up instinctively, naturally, the way a father picks up his daughter. Stevens watched this interaction with calculating interest. He noted Catherine's appearance, her resemblance to the senator, the easy affection between them. He asked casually about the child's parentage. The senator, his mind racing, claimed Catherine was the daughter of one of the other enslaved workers. Stevens nodded, said nothing more, and left. The senator knew in that moment that Stevens had seen the truth. Within days, more pointed rumors began circulating. Not just whispers about unusual household arrangements, but specific allegations that Senator Perry had fathered a child with his slave, that he treated this child as his daughter, that he'd violated the racial boundaries that maintained social order. Even though such situations were common throughout the slave states, the difference was that most white men who fathered children with enslaved women either ignored those children or sold them away. The allegation against Perry was that he'd acknowledged the child, treated her with affection, violated the fundamental rule that such relationships must never be acknowledged. Senator Perry consulted with Jonathan Wells, with Nathan Parker, with the few people who knew the full truth. They all gave the same advice: get Harriet and Catherine to safety immediately. The senator could weather the scandal if Harriet and Catherine disappeared. But if investigators found them, if the truth came out, nothing could save him. The senator refused to send them away. He couldn't send his wife and daughter into exile to save his reputation. Instead, he made a different decision. On December the 5th, 1844, Senator Philip Perry stood before the Missouri State Legislature and resigned his Senate seat, effective immediately. He gave no explanation beyond citing personal matters that required his full attention. His resignation shocked Missouri's political establishment. Senators didn't simply resign, especially not in the middle of their terms, especially not without explanation. The speculation was immediate and intense. Some claimed he was dying of illness. Others insisted he'd been forced out by scandal. The true reason remained unknown to all but a handful of people. After his resignation, Senator Perry liquidated his assets. He sold the Market Street house, sold most of his law books and furnishings, converted his property into cash and transferable securities. In January 1845, he, or Harriet, died, and Catherine boarded a steamboat heading south to New Orleans. From there, they took passage on a ship bound for Vera Cruz, Mexico. They traveled as Philip Johnson, his wife Harriet, and their daughter Catherine. The forged papers identifying Harriet as a free woman became their new reality. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. As soon as they crossed the border, Harriet and Catherine were legally free, no longer subject to Missouri law or American racial code. The iron box containing the marriage certificate and the other documents chronicling their relationship was left with Nathan Parker in Alton, with instructions to keep it sealed until everyone involved was dead. The former senator and his family settled in a small town near Puebla, Mexico, where Philip established a modest law practice serving American expatriates and Mexican clients. They lived quietly, attracted little attention, and raised Catherine in a household where she could simply be their daughter without legal complications or social censure. For the first time in her life, Harriet lived as a free woman, able to make decisions about her own time, her own activities, her own future. They had two more children in Mexico, both sons, born in 1847 and 1850, Philip Jr. and Samuel. Philip Perry died in 1863 at age 65. Having never returned to the United States, his death came suddenly, a heart seizure whilst working in his office. Harriet lived until 1879, dying at age 59 in the same house near Puebla where they'd built their life together. She outlived Philip by 16 years she spent managing the household, helping her children establish their own lives and maintaining the garden she'd cultivated behind the house. A small piece of earth that belonged to her in ways nothing had ever belonged to her in America. Catherine and her brothers buried their parents side by side in the town's cemetery under headstones that identified them simply as Philip Johnson and Harriet Johnson, beloved parents. The secret of who they really were died with them, or so it seemed. The iron box remained sealed until workers demolishing a warehouse in Louisville, Kentucky in October 1896 broke through a wall and discovered it. A historian named Theodore Campbell recognized immediately that he was looking at something extraordinary: a marriage certificate between a Missouri senator and an enslaved woman, letters discussing abolition, property documents, a journal chronicling a relationship spanning years. But 1896 was a time of increasing racial tension in America. Jim Crow laws were spreading, lynching was increasing, and any suggestion that interracial relationships could be loving and legitimate was met with violent resistance. Campbell petitioned a Kentucky judge to seal the documents by court order. The judge agreed, issuing an order sealing them until 1968. A period of 72 years that would ensure everyone directly involved was long dead. When the documents were finally unsealed in 1968, America had changed dramatically. Interracial marriage had been legal throughout the United States for only 1 year, since the Supreme Court's decision in Loving v. Virginia in 1967. Historians examining the documents faced difficult questions. Was this a love story, or was it more complicated than that? Could genuine love exist between owner and enslaved person, or did the fundamental inequality of their positions make any such relationship exploitative regardless of the feelings involved? What's undeniable is that Philip Perry and Harriet Preston created something that their society insisted was impossible. They married in defiance of law, maintained a relationship that required constant secrecy, and carried enormous risk, and ultimately chose each other over everything else. Philip Perry gave up his Senate seat, his political career, his home, and his country, rather than send Harriet and Catherine into exile. Harriet chose to stay with Philip even when she had opportunities to escape to Canada. Their story reveals both the humanity that slavery tried to destroy and the lasting damage that slavery inflicted on every relationship it touched. The marriage certificate itself remains in the archives of the Kentucky Historical Society. A simple piece of paper, faded with age, bearing the signatures of Philip Perry and Harriet Preston, along with the witnesses who risked their own safety to participate in an illegal ceremony. It represents both the impossibility and the inevitability of what happened in 1841. A relationship that couldn't exist under law but did exist in reality, a marriage that was legally void but personally binding. If you've made it to the end of this story, you've journeyed through one of the most complex and morally ambiguous chapters in American history. This wasn't a simple tale of good versus evil, but a story of two people navigating impossible circumstances, making choices that we can judge but never fully understand, unless we could walk in their shoes. Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten histories that challenge our assumptions about the past. Share this video with someone who appreciates history, that doesn't shy away from complexity and contradiction. And most importantly, let me know what you think in the comments below. Was this love or exploitation? Courage or selfishness? Can we judge them fairly from our vantage point more than a century and a half later? The past is never as distant as we like to believe. The choices made in 1841 still echo through our world today, still challenge us to think about love, law, power, and what it means to choose commitment over convenience. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story that history tried to hide.